I appreciate all that. And today, closing the part we're talking about with ethics, I've kind of tried to take you through the whole tumult, show you all a rather grand journey instead of what might be the more upfront stuff that you hear everywhere else. But we started with Aesop's fables, so I wanted to start out this one, closing out a few other Aesop's fables. One of them that I had to talk about was the eagle and the fox, and to be honest, I'm not sure if these are in the book I showed you. These are ones that I found elsewhere. But just to show you a little bit about how what we were talking about with ethics, there's some natural law aspects to ethics that supposedly everybody sort of knows. So the golden rule, people usually point out that the golden rule is relatively well distributed throughout cultures, but it can show up really differently. So for instance, golden rule according to Jesus, do unto others as they'd have them do unto you. But the very Greek Aesop's fable is the eagle and the fox. I'll read that to you now. An eagle and a fox formed an intimate friendship and decided to live near each other. The eagle built her nest in the branches of a tall tree, while the fox crept into the underwood and there produced her young. Not long after that, they had agreed upon this plan. The eagle, being in want of provision for her young ones, swooped down while the fox was out and seized upon one of the little cubs and feasted herself and her brood. The fox, on her return, discovered what happened, but was less grieved for the death of her young than for her inability to avenge them. A just retribution, however, quickly fell upon the eagle. While hovering near an altar on which some villagers were sacrificing a goat, she suddenly seized a piece of the flesh and carried it along with a burning cinder to her nest. A strong breeze soon fanned the spark into a flame, and the eaglets, as yet unfledged and helpless, were roasted in their nest and dropped down dead at the bottom of the tree. Therefore, in the sight of the eagle, the fox gobbled them up. Moral of the story, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. So that one's like 30 times more hardcore than the one you're probably used to hearing in Sunday school. But the point still remains, like the very gruesome Greeks still see that in nature there are these things that we share in common. So don't eat your friends' babies is another way to say do unto others as you'd have them do to you. Two other ones which are kind of they don't really follow the regular formula. On one hand, they both include humans, which a lot of the Aesop's fables include, animals in some regard, or almost exclusively. But also, a lot of the times the Aesop's fables. I was talking to Josh Papsdorf about this other day. A lot of ways that people will interpret the Aesop's fables is, in the end, it's really just sort of social control. It's usually like, hey, the donkey's trying to be a lion, he needs to learn his place, sort of idea. And so one interpretation of the Aesop's fables is it was just a lot of tales to tell people not to rebel or to behave and stuff like this. But these two are a little bit more abstract, and I think get to this final sort of what we're going to talk about today, as far as when we talk about the old law and the new law, what it is that God is revealing for us in the ethical theory, the moral theory of Christianity. So the first one, the old woman and the wine jar. An old woman found an empty jar which had lately been full of prime old wine, and which still retained the fragrant smell of its former contents. She greedily placed it several times to her nose, and drawing it backwards and forwards said, "Ah, most delicious! How nice must the wine itself have been, when it leaves behind in the very vessel which contained it so sweet a perfume." And the moral of the story is the memory of a good deed lives. And I like this idea, right, that like in our lives when we're living, it's not just enough that we do the right thing, but that we should live fragrant lives. Lives that even after we're gone, we can smell the sweetness of all those actions. And so, very profitably and providentially, we have this last class in this room. And what is it that we have with all these saints, except their fragrance, right? To look at the picture of the saints is to smell the fragrance of their good deeds, like old wine, that even now, just remembering them, we can only imagine what it would have been like to drink from them, face to face. But then, more so we say with Christianity, exactly through prayer, we get to drink deeply of the wine of the saints before us. And then finally, I think a good one to everybody live their life. The boy and the nettles. A boy was stung by a nettle, He ran home and told his mother, saying, "Although it hurts me very much, I only touched it gently." The mother responded, "That was just why it stung you. The next time you touch a nettle, grasp it boldly, and it will be soft as silk to your hands and not in the least hurt you." And if you're not familiar with nettles, because we're all Kansans, it's the same thing with like a head of wheat, right? You grab a head of wheat, or even a fish, right, the wrong way and gently, it will cut you. But if you grab it like this and pull it out, you won't notice. So the moral of the story is, whatever you do, do it with all your might. So now everything that I'm going to teach the rest of the hour is just sort of, icings on the cake, because I think those two, it's a profound thing to think about. The good deeds that we do are fragrant, and they leave a smell of the greatness for all who see it even after we're gone. And finally, that there's no really sort of gentle way to kind of grasp the moral life. In fact, the more we sort of like grab hand the moral life and try to pick it up gently is when the stings and pricks of the moral life get to us. But to grab it boldly and to go out and do what our Savior's called us to do in a way, I think, we'll feel the silkiness, the smoothness of the moral life. So if you remember the last two times we've been talking about the law, I talked about what the law is, the four aspects of law, and then also how Thomas Aquinas delineates out in the three main ways that we're going to talk about law as pertaining to the moral life. Everything I said about it being an outline, we're not getting to specifics, etc., but just to throw that out to remind you a little bit. So the first time we talked about philosophy itself, or when we're being more precise, metaphysics. What is the metaphysics of the moral life? And we talked about the nature of the good in and of itself, how that relates to evil. Evil is a privation, all of these things like this. And we also briefly touched upon the natural law, which, as we said, when we consider ourselves in our being as what we are, what we're constituted as, there's ways in which we can understand what is good for us based on what we are as rational creatures who participate in the divine law. And to throw it out again, we'll get to this at the end today. Just please remember always, right, that law and mercy in the Christian life are not opposed. Law, the dictate of reason promulgated by a proper authority publicly for the common good, is not to say harsh or judicial or cold, but actually what God is doing all the time, offering laws for us to follow for our own good. So going through metaphysics, the idea of the good in and of itself, how it pertains to God, talking about natural law, what it is as humans that we naturally are ordered towards, and how that helps us make decisions about the moral life. We finally run into this last aspect of what the title of my talk was: philosophy, natural law, and then Scripture. Where from Scripture do we derive moral foundations? And for Thomas, he talks about this ordered within the understanding of law that we've talked about the last two times, right? The divine law, which is the reason of God and how He orders things. The natural law, how we participate in that. He also talks about human law, but I'm not a lawyer, as they say in Oklahoma, and you don't want to, get involved in that. So we can talk about positive law some other time. Leave me alone, computer. And then, but what we're going to talk about today is the divine law, not as in God's the eternal law, how God said it. The eternal law, how it rests in God's mind, but the divine law, with the law He revealed to us. And so divine law is how God, in His infinite love, reaches out to help us specifically live a good life. And why He does that and how this is intertwined with the nature of what God is like is revealed through Scripture, is very important to this. We'll talk about that in a second. The word that I think is paramount to all of that is beatitude and what that means. We'll talk about that in a second. But just to show you that for Thomas, there's not some huge distinction between trying to decide things by our nature and then how God reveals what we should do. I throw this out because if you get into the really nitty-gritty of some of the arguments that you'll hear in theological circles within the Western Church itself, but specifically in Western and Eastern Church dialogue. One of the things that the West is accused of is having an overly rigid division between nature and supernature, law and grace. And fully admitting this as someone who is very much a student of St. Thomas Aquinas, there are Thomists, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who make way too much of this theoretical distinction. So they'll write entire moral tractates where they'll talk about ethics considered by nature and then ethics considered by supernature. And a lot of this has to do with the fist fights that stemmed from the Reformation, and they also show a very distinct after effect of the Reformation. That we would think about these things this way, get very caught up on what is works and what is grace and things like this. And a lot of people will attribute this to Thomas because of what we've been saying this whole time about law, about the different sources of moral law, etc. So what I want to point out is that although Thomas thinks there's all sorts of distinctions that are useful to make, that he himself not only does not, but also advocates not to make too much of these distinctions. He's not saying that there's this entire moral pattern that basically all other humans can follow. Oh, and then by the way, there's what Christians do. And it's very different and very odd and very set aside than everything else. One obvious way that this is the case is how Thomas Aquinas himself talks about the Old Law when he talks about the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. I'll hang that there and then talk real quick about another sort of overall aspect of moral theology, the history of moral theology, to bring up why this point is important. You can read several books about the history of ethics in Christianity, and they will make a big deal out of this fact. In early Christianity, most considerations of ethics focused on the 8 Beatitudes. 6 to 8, depending on which person you're talking to, how they levied them out. A lot of what we would consider early RCIA with the catechumenate about how you should live your life revolved around the Beatitudes. And they would connect other stories to the Beatitudes. And it's maybe a bit overdone, but there's something certainly to this, that the early church really has a focus on the Beatitudes. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, I don't know if there's some easy cutoff date, but certainly there starts to be precedent, especially when you start looking at orders like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, preaching orders, going out and especially preaching to newly minted Christians who were just recently barbarians, that you really do start to see an uptick in discussion about the Ten Commandments and basing a lot of ethical treatises on the Ten Commandments. And I think that holds over, if not exactly today in 2015, up through about 1970, where you will see a lot of the moral considerations for public consumption really do start and stem from the Ten Commandments. Now, people will make a massive deal about this as an opposition. That what you have is the overly rigid, legalistic Roman Church that cares about the Ten Commandments, and that we need to get back to a patristic, more pure, consideration of the Beatitudes. And inasmuch as there's some grain of truth to this, I do think it's something that is quite a bit overdone. There are reasons that people do this. It's a lot easier to teach people the Ten Commandments than the 8 Beatitudes. We could probably have a small Jeopardy competition real quick, and I'm guessing a lot of you could pass the Ten Commandments test, but the 8 Beatitudes might be a little bit harder. Now that's not just because of emphasis, but because of how strange the Beatitudes are as a list of moral imperatives. And that's, usually I'm talking about like the connections Christianity makes with a lot of other cultures. The Beatitudes are pretty distinct. You don't get a lot of moral, you don't get a lot of moral philosophy where people talk about why you are blessed for not doing things sometimes. Or especially why you are blessed for things that most everyone considers as bad news happening to you. But that's the distinctiveness of the Beatitudes, is the distinctiveness not only of Christianity, but our idea about God and things like this. Like I said, we'll be getting to that. But the Ten Commandments are also pretty upfront. Thou shalt not blank. And thou shalt and thou shalt nots, if anybody who's had kids, you can try to be all beatitude-y to your kids. Blessed are they that put up their toys. They will not have angry parents. No. They're like, thou shalt put those up, or else. Kids are very Ten Commandments-y, right? Charlton Heston barking commands at them. A kid will do that. But what's the guy's name? Jimmy Caviezel or whatever, who played Jesus in Mel Gibson's movie. If he's talking shit to the kids, they're probably not going to listen. So part of it is the ease of the Ten Commandments. But Thomas Aquinas thinks there's a very specific reason that the Ten Commandments come off as easier. And he says it's because they're basically just second-order comments on the natural law. Which is funny, because if you start hearing about, Okies, my people, getting in fights about putting big statues of the Ten Commandments or not on the lawn, a small political aside for me, I'm all for people wasting money on statues, because I'd rather them do that than try to fix things. But anyway, listen. The people, they're like, this is a very distinct Jewish, Judeo-Christian idea of the laws, the Ten Commandments. And people who put them up probably agree. Thomas Aquinas would go, no, actually, basically, the Ten Commandments is the natural law. And even if people don't, on their own, agree with the Ten Commandments, it's not as basic as the natural law. Remember, the first precept of the natural law is avoid evil and do good, right? So he says this is a basic of any moral code. And even when people make mistakes with the natural law, they're usually doing it in accordance with that principle. They are doing what they think is right and avoiding what they think is bad. Thomas contends that the Ten Commandments are like secondary comments on the primary counsel of the natural law that actually most people could come to on their own, except for the vagaries of history and sin and things like this. Now, this starts to be obvious when you think about how many moral codes say something to the akin of, thou shalt not murder. The contention is like, what is murder, right? So you get some people that are like, thou shalt not murder, and that means me, because I'm the king. But kill anyone else, that's not murder. That's just killing, right? So, but you see this, right? Many cultures think thou shalt not kill makes a lot of sense. Some aspect of honor thy mother and thy father, right? And if it's not them, it's some other authority figure. You go through and you see that the Ten Commandments largely are secondary comments on the primary natural law, even ones that are about God. So Thomas, maybe the more controversial part people don't talk about, is the first ones, right? About having no other gods before the one God, keeping the Sabbath even, not taking the Lord's name in vain. He says these are not things that everybody, so to speak, naturally assumes in their heart. But through natural law, wise people could and have come to similar ideas. So you get Socrates, for instance, even, if not explicitly saying it, seeming to say that there's actually a monotheistic God, either behind the pantheon of other gods, or in fact, point of fact, opposed to these fake gods. And you get monotheists in the polytheistic pagan religions making these arguments. You do get ideas about something a lot like a Sabbath, and if it's not divinely ordained, it's ideas of rest and things like this. So Thomas actually says the Ten Commandments, the reason they come off as easier than the 8 Beatitudes is because even though they're divine revelation, this is an example of God divinely revealing things for the sake of clarity and not necessity. Meaning that with a lot of error, wise people throughout different cultures would largely come up with similar moral claims. That the Ten Commandments make it really easy, specific, they're ordered well. He even makes an argument about how their very ordering is wise and things like this. This is in the Summa, the Prima Pars, no, prima secunda, the second part, first of the second part, question 100, if anybody's interested. And he goes through and he goes, not only does this all make sense, but he thinks this stems, it's the next sort of thing from the natural law, so that in history, God has implanted, by the very nature of what we are, a sort of natural law that people can understand who they are and try to make moral decisions. But we're also very admixed with sin, and we do things like worship golden calves or become slaves to Egyptians out of malfeasance. And so God's like, I'm going to give the 10 Commandments, not only to the Jews, but through the Jews, as a standing baseline example of second-order ruminations on the natural law, if you were. Now, Thomas is very obviously well acquainted with the fact that even to Jews at the time, the 10 Commandments are not like the 10 laws of the Old Testament. Depending on who you talk to, traditionally the rabbis say there's something like 613 commandments in the Old Testament that Orthodox Jews must follow. Matthew Umberger, you can go bother him more about the history of how they've come up with that many number and when they thought that and why. But so Thomas himself will talk about, in the Old Testament, there's more than just the moral law. So he'll talk about the ceremonial law, the laws of the Jewish state that are bound to their time and things like this. But he says even within the Old Testament, God has basically announced laws that are moral, that are not like the basic, fundamental, primary aspects of the natural law, but second-order discussions of them for the sake of the people of Israel, but also for the sake of the nations as they come in contact with them. So, thou shalt not have other gods besides me. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember to keep holy the Lord's day. Honor thy father and mother. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. All things that Thomas would say, eventually any pagan or someone outside of the people of Israel or the church would be able to come to conclusions thereof. But then according to Thomas, it's not, this is sort of basic stuff, but it's not the base of Christian ethics. It's, if anything, the preambula, right? The preamble of what a specifically Christian ethics would look like or be. So then what is it that makes Christian ethics specific at all? And it's not that we get commands that no one else does. Because that would go against everything we've said so far, everything that Thomas teaches, everything that he would say is true about the church. If Christians somehow had their own law set apart, then it would just be the people of Israel a second time. The people of Israel did have specific laws, only given to them to set them apart from the nations for a holy purpose. You will get people in history that give theological reasons about why Jews should not eat shrimp, but you will actually hear most rabbis saying, we don't eat shrimp because God said don't eat shrimp. And it's things like this that make us the people of Israel and other people not. Christianity does not have laws that set us apart like that just for the sake of setting us apart. At least not an idea of Christian theology and soteriology. We're not being set apart for the sake of some future aspect, like the Thomas Aquinas of the church teaches the people of Israel were. No, our distinctness is because God believed it was time for us to act in a perfected way. Not again perfect, like pure and all the things that we talked about before, but like we talked about last time, the culmination of what God has in mind for humanity. Our ethics looks different because this is ethics at the end of time. And all other ethics and all other things have been preparing, not for some alien thing completely divorced from the previous, but as the way that exceeds all other determinations before it. So another way to put this is not to think about us for a second, but to think about ethics, thinking about it in terms of God. Now, most people don't actually usually think of this. We bring up the term beatitude again, right? Beatitude, this weird phrase that, of course, has something to do with beauty, but also blessedness. And we'll talk a little bit about what Thomas thinks exactly beatitude is. But this idea of beautiful blessedness, right, like a vision of completeness, is what we usually think of in terms of ourselves. That what it means to be saved and in heaven is this beautiful, complete vision of God. But Thomas, before he ever considers once in the Summa what we should do, actually talks about God's beatitude first. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought that we serve a God who's happy? Happy in himself? Because we often don't. When we think about how we should act, we usually think about us. What will make me happy? Why am I so sad? Why can't I lose that last 20 or 80 pounds, depending on who you are? We'll often think about ethics in terms of starting right here. But one of the very unique things about Christianity is we don't talk about God just because God is the biggest being with the largest knife who can poke the hardest and can inflict the most punishment. We actually worship God because God is the happiest being. A God is the being that has beatitude in and of himself, complete in himself, needing nothing else. So that when we even conceive of who we are and our place in God's happiness, we realize that his happiness isn't dependent on us, so that he can be totally for us. We're like the icing on the cake for God. Or something even more decorative, right, than the icing. I'm not a cake person, so So have we ever stopped to think about that? We serve a God happy in and of himself. So this is clear from Scripture, even though we often don't think about it. The book of Revelation, right, book 21, 1 through 9, so the penultimate chapter. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. Also he said, Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give the fountain of water of life without payment. He who conquers shall have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. We don't think about this in those terms, like that's an ethical commandment, or that has anything to do with ethics. But the distinctiveness of the Christian life is that God himself is happy in himself, experiences beatitude as a constitutive aspect of who he is, and that this happy, beatific God is to dwell among men, the human race. And that's his purpose and his end for us. This makes things very different. So Thomas says, I answer that beatitude belongs to God in a very special manner. Nothing else is understood to be meant by the term beatitude than the perfect good of an intellectual nature, which is capable of knowing that it has a sufficiency of the good which it possesses. So, an intellectual nature, this is why we can possess beatitude as well. But the perfection of beatitude, the perfect good of an intellectual nature, which is capable of knowing that it has it. It is competent that good or ill may never befall it, which can control its own actions. All of these things belong in a most excellent manner to God, namely, to be perfect and to possess intelligence. So beatitude belongs to God in the highest degree. Again, something that we're not usually thinking of is that God is happy and is perfectly happy. Another way to put it, when the beatitude of every intellectual nature consists in understanding. Now in God, to be and to understand are one and the same thing, differing only in the manner of our understanding of them. Beatitude, therefore, must be assigned to God in the respect of his intellect. But here's the kicker for us, how this stems to us, as far as it comes to ethics. As also to the blessed, who are called the beati, the blessed ones, by reason of the assimilation to his beatitude. What is ethics but to be assimilated to the happiness of God? And so we don't have this huge distinction between how Christians act and the world acts in the idea that like God only commands certain things to Christians and then he lets the other people do other stuff. He commands us to the perfection of that which at least exists in seed form for all other people. This gets back to the Irenaeus quote that's making its rounds on Facebook again and again, which I'm happy it is, that the
glory of God.
Yeah, the glory of God is the perfection of man.
Is man fully alive?
Fully alive. It's probably perfection in the Latin, but anyway, or the Greek, sorry. But that, that's what we get at, right? Is what the ethical life is for, is to share the happiness of God. And when you start thinking of the ethical life like that, the Beatitudes start to make a whole lot of sense. Because what we're getting at is not do this and don't do that, or what we're even getting at is not just, well, if you do certain things, they're going to come back to bite you in the butt, and if you do other things, they're going to make things relatively better. That's still true, but much more. Do you want to act in a way consummate to sharing God's perfect happiness? And if you do, you will do these things, as counterintuitive as they seem. And the reason the Beatitudes sound counterintuitive is not because they're ridiculous or not well thought out or something like this, but it's because when we consider things by our nature alone, or even in a sort of philosophical way, we can usually do pretty good for ourselves, but we will still be tempted to be short-sighted. And that's not necessarily bad, right? So in most cases, if I tell you you have an ethical prerogative to not die, that usually is a pretty good rule of thumb, right? When you get in your car, one of your objectives beyond like signaling, honking only when necessary, the one that we don't ever say is like, oh, and by the way, don't die. Don't mean to die driving in the car. Right? That's what we mean by natural law, in a way, is there's like the unsaid rules that always matter, no matter what. Getting in a car, don't die, honey. Using a cell phone, do what you will, but also don't kill yourself. Using a pen, hope you do it well, also don't die, right? Because don't die is one of these basic rules of our nature. Unless dying is the sort of thing that will make you share in the happiness of God. And then we look at the example of martyrs. And we say it's not that they're contravening the natural law, but that they're acting towards its perfection and end. So that when we look at the Beatitudes and they seem counterintuitive to the world or even to ourselves, they're only counterintuitive considered with too small a vision. But with an enlarged vision towards what we're actually going for in the ethical life, they make perfect sense. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall possess the land. Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after justice, for they shall have their fill. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are they that suffer persecution for justice' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And like I said, there's plenty of this that doesn't seem to make sense on its face. The easy one people usually pick out is number 2. How in the world will the meek inherit the earth? Very little of human history seems to bear this out. Even more so, It starts to be the case, not only that history doesn't bear out that the meek inherit the earth, there's very natural considerations for why that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think about a lot of the debates that I'm not going to try to get in and embroil people with, but everything from should you own your own gun to immigration to all of these things. You'll start to see a very interesting dynamic on Facebook where people will say, Jesus Christ was a stranger, we should welcome the stranger. And then other people will go, and? So what? And you'll see Christians just go, oh, how are you misunderstanding this? And at the very least, all I want to say is, it's a very natural misunderstanding. Because by nature, again, as a dad, I think about this, I'm usually going to think about what sort of things make sure that my wife and children don't die. And that, like, my first natural impulse is to probably go overboard thinking about the whole protection angle. And so, when we consider something from the Christian angle, it's true, very true, that what we are not doing is saying, well, Christians have a different order of commands, and you pagans have something else. But we do have to realize that to follow the Beatitudes is to be called to a perfection that most people don't realize or see exists or is worthwhile. If you're going to get to convince people to do things that go against their natural inclination, you have to speak to that natural inclination and tell them why even that natural inclination is ordered towards something higher than it seems. Because the natural inclination for food, for instance, which I've been answering, obviously, for most of my life, is to eat while there's food, right? Like, I always try to give myself the excuse that it's just that I'm Irish, right? I have Irish genes. And all of us insulin-resistant Irish people during famines live, while all you skinny, lean people, you die during famines, right? Because I eat like one potato, just cholesterol collects, right? And if that's my one potato for the month, I survive. You well-behaved people, kaput, right? It's only at the abundance that's killing me, right? Anyway, sorry. No, but you see, right, for this natural inclination, I should eat. I should eat. Now, even in like natural life, you go, sure, Bo, the eating function is good, but not if it thwarts that living function that your whole body's interested in. You might want to tell your stomach, though, that if it wants to keep eating, it probably shouldn't kill the heart. Because the heart is very necessary for the eating part. We'll use that analogy in a spiritual way. There's all sorts of things we should do to survive, unless they actually kill off the highest thing we're ordered towards. The Beatitudes point this out, even if it seems counterintuitive. If you want to inherit the earth, God says, strange enough, it's the meek who will do it. It's the meek that will do it. Because the proud will maybe inherit it momentarily, but they will always lose it in the end. Into the movie Patton, right? It's talking about the Roman generals when they're coming in, marching after a victory. Everybody's hailing them on their chariot, but they hire one slave to whisper in their ear, all glory is fleeting. All glory is fleeting. The Ten Commandments, that's why they seem so strange. It's hard to just go out and sort of teach a moral theory based on the Beatitudes in a snappy way. Not because they contravene our nature, but because you have to go back to the root of our nature to understand why they ultimately make sense. The Ten Commandments are easier to teach in a way because they're sort of like the second step. Avoid evil, do good, trust me, murdering people contravenes that. So people go, okay, you're right, shouldn't go around murdering because then people will come murder me. That's an evil and not a good. Okay, so the Ten Commandments, to put it flippantly, roll off the tongue of most people's easier than the Beatitudes, but not because the Beatitudes are something different, but because they get at the core of ethics so intimately.
Well,
Yeah.
Don't the Beatitudes have to do with turning our lives over to God? The poor in spirit, meaning who do God's will. The meek, who do God's will.
Well, so it's like I paid you to throw this alley-oop to me, because that's where I was heading next.
Okay.
Good job. So one of the things that Thomas talks about with the Beatitudes is that the Beatitudes are ordered towards turning us towards God 3 different ways. The first 3, and now I'll be honest, if you ever read Thomas on this point, he actually talks about the 7 Beatitudes. The one about blessed are they that suffer persecution for justice' sake, he sort of acts, I guess, as like the topping it all off, as it were. But so we have it as 8 now. But so he says the first 3 are exactly negative imperatives. We're told in a way the things that we should start avoiding if we want to turn to the higher things. So blessed are the poor or the poor in spirit, depending on where you get the list from. Like Luke and Matthew have it slightly different. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So Thomas is saying, look, if you want to desire the kingdom of heaven, you have to be willing to either suppress or turn away or at least regulate your desire for things. Physical things, just like money or anything else, or like you were getting at, the spiritual aspect of being self-sufficient. You will not inherit the kingdom of heaven unless you turn away these goods that are goods, but only subordinated ones. And then the next 2 are like that too. Blessed are the meek, for they shall possess the land. If you're too worried about possessing the land, you will only at best have it for a small amount of time. And then that whole aspect about the fragrant wine, it dies with you. The meek will inherit the land, like the fragrance of the good wine stays. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. The idea that if we can be, again, self-sufficient, have it for ourselves, when we die, that self-sufficiency goes away. But if we mourn for other people, we pray for the dead, we think about the passing nature of time. We sing Sunrise, Sunset from The Fiddler on the Roof enough. We cry about the fact that we realize that we cannot sustain ourselves. If we mourn in that way, we will clear out the refuge that would prevent us from being comforted by God. The next 2 Thomas says, are the positive things we must do towards each other in order to begin to turn our hearts towards God and the kingdom of heaven. So if you hunger and thirst for justice, that justice will be fulfilled. You can hunger and thirst for a lot of things. You can drink wonderful wine, great coffee, eat the wonderful food we have today. But the problem is tomorrow you will be hungry again. The only thing that will be fulfilled and will be that we can drink and never reach the dregs is justice, because when Jesus Christ comes back, all things will be put in the order of his justice. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And I'm going to hold off on that one a second, because I'm going to close up with talking about the spiritual and corporal works of mercy in the year of mercy. So hold that one off real quick. He says, and finally the other 2, how did he put it? I'm blanking on what he said. Give me one second. Yeah, the last 2 Beatitudes belong to contemplative happiness, or Beatitudes itself. That's right, that's what he's saying. The first 3 set us up, and to be honest, this is where we begin to see, if you'll hear in the spiritual life, the spiritual theology or interior theology, you'll hear about the purgative, illuminative, and unitive ways. So Thomas even reads this in the Beatitudes. We must purge ourselves of things like wanting honor, wanting riches, wanting comfort in this life, in order to start attaining the kingdom of heaven. We must then illuminate ourselves with God's plan by acting just towards one another, by showing mercy. And then finally, the unitive way is where we begin to already start to be one of those beatis, right? the people who participate in the beatitude of God now. To be unified with God is to start to already enjoy His happiness here. And so the last Beatitudes, blessed are the clean of heart, for they shall see God. To have a clean heart is to already to start to enjoy the happiness of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. To have peace and to give that peace to others is already to enjoy the happiness of God. And Thomas doesn't include the last one, but I think it follows through the same. Blessed are they that suffer persecution for justice' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We get the kingdom of heaven one more time, right? If you suffer, you already enjoy the happiness, right, the beatitude Christ has on the cross. As paradoxical, counterintuitive as that sounds. The end of that section in Matthew, I think is important to remember right after verse 10. So Matthew 5:11 through 20. In many ways, it is the capstone of what the moral life is for. That's what we'll read now. Like I said, we'll have the last part about the works of mercy. Blessed are you when men revile and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. By the way, just a real quick aside. I was thinking about all the hymns we sing that are associated with the Beatitudes, and they really don't do them justice, right? It's always like, blessed are they. But then you read the actual lyrics, and you're like, man, that's hardcore, right? Blessed are those who will be persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And we're like singing it all like really nice. It's like it's false advertising almost, right? And this one, rejoice and be glad, humble are you, holy in you. I'm always like, that, I think it needs to be a dirge maybe. But anyway, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. Now people will quote that, like, I mean, again, I grew up evangelical, I'm not bashing or anything, but, people would have it on their shirts. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men. So they bring it up like, be willing to be a Christian and stand up for it. But it's actually far more profound than that. If you don't have a share in God's beatitude, how will you flavor the rest of mankind? The world is bland unless Christians share in the beatitude of God. The world is McDonald's unless Christians share in the beatitude of God. So your moral imperative, it's like Jesus is amping it up even more. He said it's not just to do the beatitudes, it's that if you don't, the world is trashy food to be spit out unless you be the salt of the world. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel and put it on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to God the Father who is in heaven. Another one where I heard this all the time as an evangelical, and it's like, I remember you having a problem with Catholics because of that works word, but anyway. But the point being, right, of course, is that like doing good works isn't like, you earn bonus points with God. It's that unless there are people who shine with the happiness of God, the world is in darkness. Unless people are alive with the love of God, it's as if the city on the hill, which in the ancient world, that's where people would go up for defense, or where the governance happened. Unless people are alight with the love of God, unless there are beati in the world, there is no city on the hill. Anarchy reigns. People act like this is all like a really nice pep talk Jesus is giving, but now we start to see the stringency of what he's saying. And then the next part, he just goes full bore for this. Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot, not one iota, not one dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But he who does them and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Which again, it's always funny to me where people cut off reading the Bible. Because you can sort of like cut off the Beatitudes at one point, and then it really is the sort of, blessed are they. But if you actually read through the whole thing, we need to be singing, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and the scribes, you're going to hell, right? I mean, that's hardcore. But that's what Christians are doing. Not because we have some separate thing to do, not because we have some separate law like the Pharisees and the scribes understood Israel at the time to be done. We are the whole point of the law. The burden Christ gives us, he means it when he says it's an easy yoke, because it's easy in that there's not like this minutia to worry about, but a yoke it is. In the end times, brothers and sisters, we have been given the opportunity to be the perfection of what ethics was always about. To share in the happiness and the beatitude of God. What a great weight it is, but what an honorable calling that Jesus Christ himself said we can do if we will be humble, poor in spirit, all of those 8 things. So the final thing that I'd like to wrap up on, it's the year of mercy. How are we to be merciful to one another? After everything we just said, I hope you see that mercy is not something opposed to the law. Mercy is the fulfillment of the law. To be merciful to others is to be able to obtain mercy back. What is mercy? Thomas makes a very distinct point. Mercy is not ignoring justice or turning it aside. It is the pity a strong person has for the weak. And because the person in the stronger position is in a position of strength, extends that pity to the person who is in anguish. That's how Thomas points it out. So mercy has a very economic base in the Jewish understanding that eventually comes through in the Christian one, is that who can be merciful? And if you think about all the times Jesus talks about mercy in the parables, lots of them have to do with debtors. Why can I be merciful to someone who I hold a debt against? Because I have the right to decide how much I get paid back. Like, someone can't do that for me. Like, if someone comes to me and is like, oh, I owe Dusty money, I'm like, well, be merciful. Don't pay Dusty. He's fine. That's not mercy, right? That's me deciding stuff for people. But Dusty can. Dusty can say, give me 25 instead of 30, or whatever it might be. And so, this economic metaphor, of course, grows out into all sorts of different aspects. Mercy is what, if you are in the position of strength, what you can, through pity, extend to someone weaker than you, in more anguish than you. And if you remember the one parable where we actually get someone thrown into the fire and there's gnashing of teeth, it's that someone extended mercy to him, and he would not extend it to someone in a worse position than him. This has nothing to do with being touchy-feely or nice or ignoring the law. It's to actually really be, in many ways, legalistic. I have the legal right to not ask for the fullness of a penalty. And you start looking at this with the corporal and spiritual acts of mercy, and it comes up. To feed the hungry. You have food and they don't. It's your prerogative that you can give it to them. To give to drink who's thirsty. To clothe the naked, right? Who wants that? Naked people running around. Give them some shoes, right? To shelter the homeless, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned, and to bury the dead. One of my favorite titles for any of Flannery O'Connor's stories ever is, I'm going to mess it up. Ain't no one poorer than dead. You can't be poorer than dead. You can't be poorer than dead, right? The dead are the most impoverished. Will you bury them? Will you pray for them? To counsel the doubtful, instruct the ignorant, admonish the sinner, comfort the sorrowful, forgive all injuries, bear wrongs patiently, pray for the living and the dead. And that's the final one that I want to point out. Too many times mercy is being seen as like, let's just ignore what happened. Seems to forget that for hundreds of years we've been saying that it is merciful to instruct the ignorant and to admonish the sinner. You who know because God has favored you and He's put you in this church and He's taught you what sin is and how bad it is. What lack of pity do you have that you wouldn't let a sinner know what they've gotten themselves into? Now, of course, all good things the devil can make into a bad thing. So too often people see admonish the sinner, and what they mean is castigate someone in the out group, make yourself feel better than someone else, belittle someone, make them feel terrible. All these things that Pope Francis, I think, is doing a good job of pointing out. Too often we hide behind a good thing in order to have a subtle thing that we're actually doing. You're dead right. If you are not pure of heart and poor of spirit, you have no room to admonish the sinner. But that doesn't mean that what the church is teaching us is to shut up and never talk. What the church is saying is like, you know what you probably need to get busy doing? Having a pure heart. Being poor in spirit. Because for the love of Jesus Christ, people need to be admonished that they're sinners. But for the love of Jesus Christ, you better be a good vessel for it. You better be a good vessel for it. Mercy is not opposed to justice. Mercy is not opposed to law. I'm going to mess up the psalm. There's the proverb, psalm, right? Justice and mercy shall meet, and the other two shall kiss. Yeah. And that's what we're going at. The Beatitudes, like I said, are not this separate thing. They're perfection of what God has implanted in us all along. Thank you very much.